Imagine dying at 38 years old. Imagine spending your entire life fighting for something the world thinks is impossible. Imagine being mocked, ridiculed, called insane, called immoral, called dangerous. Imagine watching your ideas get buried with you. Imagine your own husband trying to honor your memory, accidentally giving the world ammunition to destroy your reputation for the next 100 years. Imagine being forgotten, erased, reduced to a footnote as that woman who had questionable morals. And then imagine, 130 years after your death, women gathering at your grave crying because they finally understand. You were right about everything. You saw the future. You demanded rights that wouldn't exist for over a century. You were a prophet, and the world called you mad. This is the story of Mary Wollstonecraft. And if you're a woman who can vote, who can own property, who can get an education, who can have a bank account, who can choose your own career, who can leave an abusive marriage, who can control your own life, you owe everything to a woman you've probably never heard of. Today, we're going to fix that. This is the story of the woman who invented feminism, the woman who changed the world, the woman history tried to erase. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why her story is the most important women's empowerment story ever told. Let's begin at the beginning, London, 1759. But before we get to Mary's birth, we need to understand the world she was born into. Because without context, you can't understand just how revolutionary, how impossible, how absolutely insane her ideas were. The world before Mary. In the 17th century, women were not human beings in the eyes of the law. Let me say that again. Women were not legally human. They were property. First, they belonged to their fathers. Then, when they married, they belonged to their husbands. Everything a woman owned became her husband's property the moment she said, "I do." Her money, her inheritance, her clothes, her jewelry, her body. All of it legally belonged to her husband. A woman could not sign a contract, could not sue in court, could not testify as a witness in most cases, could not vote, could not hold political office, could not attend university, could not become a doctor or lawyer or architect or anything requiring formal education, could not own a business in her own name, could not get divorced unless her husband agreed, could not keep her children if her husband decided to take them, could not refuse her husband sexually. Marital rape wasn't even a concept because how could it be rape when she was his property? If a woman never married, she remained under her father's authority her entire life. If her father died, she came under the authority of her brothers or male relatives. There was no legal pathway for a woman to be fully independent, none. And here's the thing, everyone believed this was natural. This was God's design. This was biology. This was how the world was supposed to work. Women were weaker. Women were irrational. Women were emotional. Women were meant to serve men, bear children, and maintain households. That was their purpose, their only purpose. Education for women? Pointless. Why educate someone whose only job is to be pleasant and obedient? Political rights for women? Laughable. Women's brains couldn't handle complex thought. Economic independence for women? Dangerous. Women needed male protection and guidance. This wasn't just law, this was culture, this was religion, this was science. The greatest minds of the time, the philosophers and doctors and religious leaders, all agreed. Women were naturally inferior to men in every way that mattered. This was the world Mary Wollstonecraft was born into. April 27th, 1759, in Spitalfields, London. And from day one, her life was a nightmare. Mary's childhood, born into hell. Mary's father, Edward John Wollstonecraft, was what we would today call an abusive alcoholic. But in the 1700s, he was just considered a normal man having a rough time. The family had some money initially. Edward inherited a decent sum from his father, but he was incompetent with finances and had delusions of grandeur. He wanted to be a gentleman farmer. He wanted status and respect without actually working for it. So he moved the family around constantly, trying different business ventures, failing at each one, drinking away the money, and taking out his frustrations on his wife and children. Mary watched her father beat her mother, regularly, violently, and there was nothing anyone could do about it because, legally, a man had the right to discipline his wife. Marital abuse wasn't a crime. It was a private family matter. Mary would later write about sleeping outside her mother's bedroom door, a child lying on the cold floor, listening for sounds of violence, ready to run in and try to protect her mother from her father's fists. Imagine being 8, 9, 10 years old, and that's your job. That's your childhood. Guarding your mother from your father, knowing that at any moment you might hear her screams, knowing there's nothing you can really do but trying anyway. That was Mary's life, and her mother, Elizabeth, broken down by years of abuse and repeated pregnancies, actually favored Mary's older brother, Edward, because he was male, because he would inherit what little the family had left, because in that world, sons mattered and daughters were burdens. So Mary grew up in a house where her father beat her mother favored her brother, and she was just another mouth to feed, another daughter without prospects, another girl destined for marriage or servitude. But something in Mary refused to accept this. Something in her looked at the world around her and said, "This is wrong. This is all wrong. There has to be another way." As the family's finances deteriorated, they moved from place to place. Yorkshire, Beverley, Wales, back to London, always chasing Edward's failed dreams, always sinking deeper into poverty. Mary received some basic education, but nothing formal. Girls from middle-class families might learn reading, writing, basic arithmetic, maybe some music or drawing. Just enough to be pleasant company, but not so much that they'd develop dangerous ideas. But Mary wanted more. She taught herself. She read every book she could get her hands on. She observed everything. She questioned everything. And she formed a friendship that would save her life. A young woman named Fanny Blood. Fanny was artistic, intelligent, sensitive. She understood Mary in a way no one else did. They became inseparable. Some historians believe they were lovers. Others say they were just deeply devoted friends. In that era, the line between female friendship and romance was often blurred because women's emotional lives with each other weren't taken seriously by men anyway. What matters is that Fanny gave Mary something to live for, someone who believed in her, someone who saw her potential. But Mary's home life continued to deteriorate. By the time Mary was 19, she'd had enough. In 1778, she did something almost unthinkable for a young woman of her class. She left home, just walked away. No husband, no male guardian, no plan, just determination to escape. The escape and reinvention. So picture this, Mary Wollstonecraft, 19 years old, virtually penniless, no connections, no qualifications, in a world that offers women essentially 3 options: marriage, domestic service, or prostitution. That's it. Those are the choices. She chose none of them. Instead, she found work as a lady's companion, basically a paid friend for wealthy women. It was one of the few respectable jobs available to educated but poor women. You'd live with a wealthy family, keep the lady of the house company, read to her, accompany her on walks, basically be her servant, but with a slightly higher status than the actual servants. Mary took a position with a wealthy widow in Bath, and she hated every second of it. Being a companion meant being subservient, agreeing with everything, never expressing your own opinion, being pleasant and decorative and utterly without agency. But it gave her something invaluable: exposure to wealth, education, and the social world of the upper classes. She saw how they lived, how they thought, how they maintained their power. And she saw how the wealthy women, despite all their money, were still prisoners, gilded cages, but cages nonetheless. Then, in 1780, something happened that would define the rest of Mary's life. Her mother became seriously ill, and Mary's sister Eliza sent an urgent message begging Mary to come home. Mary dropped everything and returned. She nursed her mother through her final illness. Watched the woman who'd never shown her much affection waste away, still broken by years of abuse and exhaustion. Elizabeth Wollstonecraft died in 1782, and Mary felt something complicated. Grief, yes, but also rage. Rage that her mother's entire life had been wasted, that she'd never been happy, never been free, never been anything more than someone's wife and someone's mother. Mary vowed, standing over her mother's grave, that she would never let that happen to her. She would never be some man's property. She would never waste her life being pleasant and obedient and small. But then came Eliza. Mary's younger sister had gotten married to a man named Meredith Bishop. And within months of the marriage, Eliza was falling apart. She'd just given birth to a daughter, and she was suffering what we would today recognize as severe postpartum depression, possibly even postpartum psychosis. She was hearing things, seeing things, terrified of her husband, talking about harming herself, and her husband's solution: keep her locked up, keep her quiet. This was normal treatment for hysterical women. Mary went to visit Eliza and was horrified by what she found. Her sister, barely coherent, clearly in the midst of a mental health crisis, being treated like a mad animal that needed to be contained. And Mary made a decision that would scandalize society and define her character. She kidnapped her own sister. The kidnapping that changed everything. Yes, kidnapped. In January 1784, Mary literally sneaked into Eliza's home and helped her escape. They fled to lodgings where Meredith Bishop couldn't find them. This was insanely dangerous and illegal. A married woman belonged to her husband. By law, Mary was helping a wife run away from her legal owner. She was committing a crime. If caught, both of them could face serious consequences. But Mary didn't care. She watched her sister deteriorate in that house and decided that legality mattered less than humanity. They hid for weeks. Meredith searched for them, threatened legal action, demanded his wife back, but Mary held firm. And here's the tragedy: Eliza had to leave her infant daughter behind. Because children belonged to the father. If a woman left her husband, she had no legal right to her children. None. The husband could keep them, and she had no recourse. Can you imagine? Having to choose between your sanity and your child? That's the choice Eliza faced. That's the choice thousands of women faced in that era. And it broke something in Mary. It radicalized her. She saw up close and personal exactly how the legal system destroyed women's lives. But now Mary had a problem. She had herself and her sister to support. No money, no prospects, damaged reputations because of the scandal. What could two unmarried women possibly do? Mary had an idea. She would start a school. In 1784, Mary, along with Eliza and their friend Fanny Blood, opened a girls' school in Newington Green, a village outside London. This was bold. Very few women ran their own businesses. Schools were typically run by men or by religious institutions. But Mary convinced some local supporters to back her, found a location, and opened her doors. And for a brief, shining moment, things worked. The school attracted students. Mary proved to be a gifted teacher. She didn't just teach girls how to be pleasant and obedient. She taught them to think, to question, to use their minds. She was implementing ideas about female education that were decades ahead of her time. And she was supporting herself and her sister through her own work, not through marriage or male patronage. She was living proof that women could be independent. But then disaster struck. Fanny Blood, Mary's beloved friend, got married and moved to Lisbon, Portugal. Within months, Fanny was pregnant and having complications. She sent for Mary, begging her to come. Mary abandoned her school, borrowed money she didn't have, and sailed to Portugal to be with her friend. She arrived just in time to watch Fanny die in childbirth. The baby died too. Mary was devastated. She'd lost her closest friend, the person who understood her best. And she'd destroyed her school in the process. While she was gone, the school fell apart. Students left. Creditors came calling. By the time Mary returned to England, broken-hearted and exhausted, the school was finished. She was 26 years old. Broke, alone, failed. And this is where most women of her time would have given up, would have found a husband, any husband, and resigned themselves to conventional life. But Mary wasn't most women. Instead, she decided to become a writer. Becoming a writer in a man's world. Here's what you need to understand about being a female writer in 1786. It was essentially impossible. Men controlled publishing. Men controlled criticism. Men controlled what was considered serious literature versus silly female scribblings. Women who wrote typically published anonymously or under male pseudonyms because signing your real name as a woman meant your work wouldn't be taken seriously. It would be dismissed as emotional, frivolous, not worth reading. The few women who did publish under their own names usually wrote novels about romance and domesticity, safe topics, appropriate topics for the female mind. But Mary wasn't interested in being safe. She had things to say, important things, dangerous things. Her first book was Thoughts on the Education of Daughters, published in 1787. It was a treatise on how girls should be educated not just to be wives and mothers, but to be thinking, rational human beings. Revolutionary idea, right? Women having actual thoughts worth developing? The book didn't make much money, but it got her noticed. It got her introduced to Joseph Johnson, a radical publisher in London who believed in progressive ideas and wasn't afraid to publish controversial material. Johnson became Mary's patron, employer, and friend. He hired her as a reviewer and translator for his publication, The Analytical Review. He paid her a regular salary. He gave her work that used her mind, not just her domestic skills. For the first time in her life, Mary had financial stability based on her own intellectual labor. She was a professional writer. This was almost unheard of for a woman. And working for Johnson brought her into contact with the radical intellectual circle of London. These were the artists, writers, philosophers, and activists who were questioning everything about society. They were debating new ideas about government, equality, human rights, reason versus tradition. This was the tail end of the Enlightenment, and these men, yes, mostly men, were reimagining the world. And suddenly, Mary was in the room. The only woman in most of these gatherings, holding her own in philosophical debates with some of the greatest minds in England. She met William Blake, the poet, Henry Fuseli, the artist, Thomas Paine, the revolutionary, Tom Wedgwood, the abolitionist. These men were shocked to find a woman who could debate politics, philosophy, and ethics at their level. Some of them respected her. Some of them were attracted to her. Some of them dismissed her as an amusing oddity. Mary kept showing up, kept speaking her mind, kept writing. And then, in 1789, something happened that would change her life and the course of history. The French Revolution began. The Bastille fell. The French people rose up against their monarchs and declared that all men were created equal, with natural rights that couldn't be taken away. Liberty, equality, fraternity. It was the most exciting political moment in Europe. The old order was being torn down. A new world was being born, and intellectuals across Europe were debating what it all meant. Were the revolutionaries heroes or murderers? Was monarchy over? What would replace it? What did equality actually mean? And in 1790, a conservative British politician named Edmund Burke published a book called Reflections on the Revolution in France. Burke argued that the revolution was chaos, that tradition and hierarchy were necessary, that tearing down the old systems would lead to disaster. His book became a bestseller. The establishment loved it. It justified their fear of change. The reply that started it all. Mary read Burke's book and was furious. Here was this privileged man defending a system that oppressed millions of people, including every woman in Europe. Here was this intellectual arguing that some people were naturally meant to rule and others were naturally meant to obey. Everything in Mary's experience, everything she'd witnessed with her family, her sister, her friends, contradicted this. She sat down and wrote a response. In just 30 days, she wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Men, published in 1790. It was a passionate, eloquent, devastating critique of Burke's arguments. She argued that tradition doesn't justify oppression, that hereditary power is irrational, that all people have natural rights that don't depend on their birth or social class. The book was published anonymously at first, and it was a sensation. People were talking about it everywhere. Who wrote this brilliant takedown of Edmund Burke? The speculation was wild. And then Joseph Johnson revealed that the author was a woman, Mary Wollstonecraft. The reaction was mixed. Some people were impressed. A woman could write political philosophy? Incredible. Others were dismissive. Of course it was emotional and overwrought. It was written by a woman. Her femininity was used both to praise and dismiss her work. But Mary didn't care about the critics, because writing that book had awakened something in her. She'd been arguing about the rights of men, about class and power and oppression, but the whole time a thought kept nagging at her. What about women? If all men have natural rights, what about women? If hereditary power is irrational, what about the power men have over women? If education and reason can elevate the poor, what about the half of humanity that's denied both? She couldn't stop thinking about it. And in 1792, she sat down to write the most important book of her life, The book that would change everything. The book that society would try to suppress for over 100 years. A vindication of the rights of woman. And this is where Mary Wollstonecraft became immortal. The book that shocked the world. Imagine sitting down to write something you know will make everyone hate you. Imagine putting into words ideas so radical that even your friends will think you've gone too far. Imagine arguing for something that seems impossible, absurd, against nature itself. And imagine doing it anyway because you know, in your bones, that you're right. That's what Mary did. A Vindication of the Rights of Woman was published in 1792. It was 300 pages of pure revolutionary thought, and it went after everything, every assumption, every tradition, every belief about women's nature and place in society. Let me break down her main arguments because they're still radical today, over 200 years later. First, Mary argued that women are not naturally inferior to men. The reason women seem weaker, less intelligent, less capable is because they're denied education and opportunity from birth. Girls are taught to be decorative, not thoughtful. They're taught to please men, not develop their own minds. They're given novels and music lessons instead of mathematics and philosophy. And then society looks at the results of this deliberate intellectual stunting and says, "See, women are naturally stupid." Mary said that's insane. That's circular logic. You can't deny someone education and then use their ignorance as proof they don't deserve education. Second, she argued that female education should be identical to male education. Not just reading and writing, but mathematics, science, philosophy, political theory, everything. Because women's minds are just as capable as men's minds. The only difference is opportunity. This was a shocking claim. Most people believed women's brains were literally smaller and less developed, that women couldn't handle complex or abstract thought, that educating women beyond basic literacy was not just pointless, but actually dangerous. It would make them unhappy by giving them aspirations they couldn't fulfill. It would make them unnatural. Mary said that's nonsense. The only thing unnatural is deliberately keeping half of humanity ignorant. Third, she argued that the current marriage system is essentially legalized prostitution. A woman with no education, no skills, no ability to support herself has only one option: find a man to marry. She trades her body, her domestic labor, and her obedience for financial support. She has no choice in the matter. That's not a partnership. That's not love. That's economic coercion. And Mary didn't just criticize the system, she proposed solutions, radical solutions that wouldn't be implemented for over 100 years. Women should have access to all professions, not just domestic service and teaching. Women should be able to own property in their own names, even after marriage. Women should have legal rights over their own children. Women should be able to divorce abusive husbands. Women should have political representation. Women should vote. Read that last one again. In 1792, Mary Wollstonecraft argued that women should vote. It would be 128 years before women got the right to vote in Britain. 128 years. She was more than a century ahead of her time. But here's what made her argument so powerful and so different from anything that came before. Mary didn't base her claims on emotion or sentiment. She didn't say women deserve rights because they're naturally pure or moral, or because they're mothers. She based her argument on reason, on Enlightenment philosophy, on the same principles that the revolutionaries in France were using to overthrow monarchy. She said, if you believe humans have natural rights, that must include women. If you believe reason should govern society instead of tradition, then you have to apply reason to gender roles. If you believe education elevates humanity, then you have to educate all humans, not just half of them. She used the same arguments that men were using to demand their own freedom, and she applied them to women. And the male intellectuals who'd been cheering for revolution suddenly found themselves trapped by their own logic. The book was a sensation. It sold out its first edition in days. It was translated into French. It was debated in salons and coffeehouses across Europe. Progressive thinkers praised it. Conservative thinkers attacked it viciously. Women read it in secret and felt, for the first time, that someone understood, that someone had put into words the frustration and injustice they'd felt their whole lives but had no language for. Mary Wollstonecraft had given them that language. She'd given them arguments. She'd given them hope. But she'd also made herself a target. The attacks began immediately. Critics called her unwomanly, unnatural, dangerous. They said she wanted to destroy the family. She wanted to turn women into men. She wanted chaos and social breakdown. Religious leaders said she was defying God's design, that the Bible clearly states women should be subordinate to men, that she was leading women into sin and damnation. Male philosophers who'd been her friends suddenly distanced themselves. Supporting women's rights was acceptable as a mild, theoretical position, but Mary had gone too far. She'd actually demanded real, concrete changes to law and society. That was too much. Paris, revolution, and heartbreak. But Mary wasn't done being radical. In December 1792, at age 33, she did something that respectable women simply did not do. She moved to Paris, alone, in the middle of a revolution. France was in chaos. The monarchy had been overthrown, the Republic had been declared, and the reign of terror was beginning. This was possibly the worst time in history to visit Paris as a British citizen. Britain and France were on the brink of war. Foreigners were viewed with suspicion. Revolutionary fervor had turned violent. The guillotines were running daily. People were being executed for the slightest suspicion of counter-revolutionary sentiment, and Mary Wollstonecraft walked right into it. Why? Because she wanted to witness history. She wanted to see the revolution firsthand. She wanted to write about it, document it, understand it. She was a journalist, a philosopher, a historian in the making, and she wasn't going to let fear stop her. She arrived in Paris and immediately immersed herself in revolutionary society. She attended political meetings, she met with revolutionaries, she watched the proceedings of the National Convention, she wandered the streets, observing everything, taking notes, planning her next book. And she watched the revolution turn dark. The September massacres had just happened. Mobs had pulled prisoners from jails and murdered them in the streets. The king was about to be tried and executed. The Committee of Public Safety was consolidating power. Robespierre was rising. The terror was coming. Mary watched it all with growing horror. She'd supported the revolution in theory. She'd believed in liberty and equality. But seeing violence and mob rule up close was different from reading about political philosophy in a London coffee house. She began writing a history of the French Revolution, trying to make sense of what she was witnessing. But then something happened that would derail everything. She fell in love. His name was Gilbert Imlay. He was an American adventurer, a businessman dealing in goods and shipping, a charming talker with big dreams and no scruples. And Mary, who'd spent her whole life being serious and intellectual and revolutionary, fell for him completely. This is one of the tragic ironies of her life. This woman who'd written brilliantly about how romantic love makes women stupid, how women need to be rational and independent, how attaching your happiness to a man is a trap. She fell into that exact trap. Imlay was handsome and charming, and he told her what she wanted to hear, that she was brilliant, that she was beautiful, that he admired her mind, that he was different from other men, that he believed in equality between partners. Mary had spent 33 years guarding her independence, refusing to marry, refusing to compromise her freedom. And then Imlay walked into her life and she gave him everything. They became lovers. This was scandalous for an unmarried woman, but Mary didn't care. She believed in living by her principles, not society's hypocritical rules. She'd written that women should have sexual freedom just like men, that marriage shouldn't be necessary for relationships, that love between equals was beautiful and natural. So, she practiced what she preached. By spring of 1793, Mary was pregnant, and Imlay was pulling away. He registered her as his wife with the American embassy to protect her from persecution as a British citizen during wartime. But it was a lie. They weren't married. And increasingly, Imlay wasn't around. He was always traveling for business, always had meetings, always had excuses. Mary, pregnant and alone in revolutionary Paris, began to realize she'd made a terrible mistake. She'd trusted the wrong man. She'd confused charm with character. In May 1794, Mary gave birth to a daughter. She named her Fanny, after her dead friend. And for a brief moment, Mary was happy. She had a child, she was writing, she was surviving in one of the most dangerous cities in Europe. But Imlay wasn't there. He'd gone to London on business. He sent letters making excuses, promising to return, sending money occasionally, but he wasn't coming back, and Mary knew it. The darkness descends. In 1795, Mary returned to London with baby Fanny, hoping to reconcile with Imlay. She found him living with another woman. He'd moved on. He'd never intended to be a father or partner. He'd been using Mary the whole time, and now he was done with her. Mary was devastated. She'd sacrificed her reputation for this man. She'd given up her independence, the thing she valued most. She'd had his child outside of marriage, which marked her as a fallen woman in society's eyes. And he didn't even care. She'd become exactly what she'd warned other women not to become, dependent on a man who didn't love her. The despair was crushing. Mary had always been strong. She'd survived poverty, family trauma, professional failure, and kept going. But this broke something in her. The combination of heartbreak, social ostracism, and the realization that she'd betrayed her own principles, it was too much. In May 1795, Mary Wollstonecraft walked to Putney Bridge over the Thames River. It was raining. She stood at the edge, and she jumped. She intended to drown. She'd soaked her clothes in water beforehand so they'd weigh her down and she'd sink faster. She wanted to die. This brilliant, revolutionary woman who'd changed the world with her words wanted to end her life because a mediocre man had broken her heart. But she didn't die. Fishermen saw her jump. They pulled her out of the river. They saved her life against her will. Mary woke up in her lodgings, still alive, still heartbroken, still trapped in a world that punished women for everything. And somehow she kept going. Imlay, feeling guilty, asked Mary to do him a favor. He needed someone to travel to Scandinavia on business to recover some money from a failed investment. Would she go? Maybe a trip would help her recover from her depression. Mary agreed. In summer 1795, she traveled to Sweden, Norway, and Denmark with baby Fanny and a maid. It was an extraordinary journey for a single woman with an infant. She traveled through remote areas, dealt with business negotiations, navigated foreign languages and customs, all while nursing a baby and fighting depression. And she wrote. She wrote letters describing everything she saw. The landscapes, the people, her thoughts and feelings. These letters would later be published as letters written during a short residence in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. It became one of her most popular books. The writing was beautiful, melancholic, deeply personal. Readers fell in love with her voice. When she returned to London in autumn 1795, Imlay was still done with her. There would be no reconciliation, and Mary fell into darkness again. In October 1795, she attempted suicide a second time. She took a massive dose of laudanum, enough to kill her, but again, she was found in time. Again, she survived. This woman had survived poverty, revolution, heartbreak, and 2 suicide attempts, and she still wasn't done. Because in early 1796, a man named William Godwin came back into her life, finding real love at last. William Godwin was a philosopher, a writer, and part of the same radical intellectual circle Mary had moved in before Paris. They'd met years earlier and hadn't particularly liked each other. He'd found her too passionate and emotional. She'd found him too cold and analytical. But when they reconnected in 1796, both had changed. Godwin had read Mary's letter book from Scandinavia and been deeply moved by it. He saw her vulnerability, her intelligence, her depth. And Mary, wounded by Imlay, appreciated Godwin's steadiness and intellectual honesty. They became friends first. They'd meet for tea and talk for hours about philosophy, politics, books. Then they became lovers. But this time, Mary was careful. She maintained her own lodgings. She didn't give up her independence. She and Godwin lived separately and met when they chose to. It was a remarkably modern arrangement. They were partners but not dependent on each other. Equals who chose each other daily rather than being bound by legal obligation. Both of them were philosophically opposed to marriage. Godwin had written extensively about how marriage was an oppressive institution. Mary had built her career on criticizing marriage laws. They believed their relationship was more moral and honest without the legal chains. But then Mary got pregnant, and suddenly, principle met reality. An unmarried woman with 1 illegitimate child was already scandalous. 2 would destroy what remained of her reputation and her ability to work. More importantly, without marriage, this second child would have no legal status, no right to inheritance, no protection. So in March 1797, Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin got married quietly at a church in London. They were both slightly embarrassed about it. They'd spent years arguing against marriage, and here they were, getting married. But they rationalized it as necessary for the child's sake. and they tried to maintain their independence even within marriage. They still kept separate residences, though Mary moved to a house next door to Godwin's. They'd work separately during the day and come together in the evenings. It was as close to an equal modern marriage as the 18th century could offer. Mary was happy, genuinely happy. She was pregnant, married to a man who respected her mind and her work, still writing and working, raising Fanny, and looking forward to another child. She wrote to friends that she felt, for the first time, that life might actually work out, that maybe she could have both intellectual fulfillment and family, that maybe she'd found a way to live according to her principles. On August 30th, 1797, Mary went into labor. The birth was long and difficult. She delivered a baby girl. They named her Mary after her mother. Little Mary, who would grow up to write a little book called Frankenstein and create an entire genre of literature. But we'll get to that. The immediate problem was that the placenta didn't deliver properly. Pieces remained inside Mary's uterus. In the 1700s, this was often fatal. Infection was inevitable. The doctors tried to manually remove the placental fragments, without anesthesia, without antiseptics. Can you imagine the pain, the trauma? And then they waited to see if infection would set in. It did. Death and character assassination. Over the next 11 days, Mary Wollstonecraft died slowly of septicemia, puerperal fever they called it, childbed fever, blood poisoning from post-birth infection. It was a common way for women to die, and there was no cure. Mary was feverish, in agony, drifting in and out of consciousness. Godwin sat by her bedside, helpless. The woman who'd survived poverty, revolution, heartbreak, and 2 suicide attempts was being killed by childbirth, the most natural, common thing in the world. On September 10th, 1797, Mary Wollstonecraft died. She was 38 years old. She left behind 2 infant daughters, a devastated husband, and a collection of writings that should have changed the world. Godwin was shattered. He'd finally found a partner who matched him intellectually and emotionally, and she was gone. He dealt with his grief the way writers do. He wrote. In 1798, Godwin published Memoirs of the Author of a Vindication of the Rights of Woman. He intended it as a loving tribute to his wife. He wanted the world to know who she really was, her struggles, her courage, her complexity. So he told the truth, all of it. He wrote about her affair with Imlay, about her illegitimate child, about her suicide attempts, about her unconventional views on sex and marriage, about her struggles with depression. He thought he was honoring her by being honest, by showing that she was a real, flawed, complicated human being who'd still achieved greatness. He was wrong. The book destroyed her reputation for the next 100 years. Society read Godwin's honest memoir and decided that Mary Wollstonecraft was exactly what they'd always suspected, an immoral woman. A woman who'd had sex outside marriage. A woman who'd attempted suicide twice, which was both a crime and a sin. A woman who'd defied every social convention, and therefore everything she'd written could be dismissed. Her ideas about women's rights, the ravings of a woman with loose morals. Her philosophy, corrupted by her sexuality. Her demands for education and equality, the bitter complaints of a woman who couldn't keep a man. For decades, Mary Wollstonecraft became a cautionary tale. This is what happens to women who think too much, who demand too much, who refuse to know their place. They end up alone, disgraced, dead at 38. Her books went out of print. Her name became synonymous with dangerous femininity. Even women who agreed with some of her ideas distanced themselves from her because being associated with Mary Wollstonecraft meant being labeled immoral. The women's rights movement that slowly developed through the 1800s carefully avoided mentioning her. Early feminists wanted to be seen as respectable, moral, traditional women who just wanted a few reasonable reforms. Mary was too radical, too scandalous, too easy for opponents to use as an example of feminist hypocrisy. So they left her out of the story. They built on her foundation while pretending she didn't exist. It was a calculated betrayal, but maybe a necessary one given the times, because change was happening slowly, very slowly. Throughout the 1800s, women began pushing for rights. Education for girls expanded. Married women's property laws were reformed in some places. Women entered professions like teaching and nursing. Divorce became slightly easier in some jurisdictions. Women's suffrage movements began forming. But it was incremental, tiny steps over decades, and the women fighting these battles often didn't even know they were following a path Mary Wollstonecraft had mapped out a century earlier. The suffragettes discover the truth. And then, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, something changed. A new generation of feminists emerged. The suffragettes, women who were done asking politely for rights, women who were ready to fight, who chained themselves to railings, who went on hunger strikes, who broke windows and bombed mailboxes and disrupted political meetings. These were radical women, and radical women weren't afraid of Mary Wollstonecraft anymore. They went back and read A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, and they were stunned. Everything they were fighting for, votes for women, equal education, property rights, professional opportunities, legal equality, Mary had demanded in 1792. She'd written it all down. She'd made all the arguments they were making. She'd predicted every objection they were facing. She'd laid out a complete philosophical foundation for women's liberation, and society had buried it for over 100 years. The suffragettes were angry. They'd been told they were radicals, that their ideas were new and dangerous and against nature. And here was proof that these ideas had existed for over a century, that the establishment had known about them and actively suppressed them, that Mary Wollstonecraft had been erased from history because her ideas were too dangerous to acknowledge. So they reclaimed her. They made pilgrimages to her grave. They reprinted her books. They wrote about her life. They said, yes, she had an affair. Yes, she had a child outside marriage. Yes, she attempted suicide. And none of that changes the fact that she was right about everything. They refused to let her personal life be used to dismiss her ideas. And when Britain finally gave women the right to vote in 1928, 136 years after Mary demanded it, suffragettes laid flowers on her grave. They stood there and said, "We did it. We finished what you started. It took over a century, but we got there. Thank you." Mary's daughter, Mary Shelley, had written Frankenstein when she was just 19. The book was about a creature created from dead parts, brought to life, and then rejected by its creator. Some scholars believe it was Mary Shelley's way of processing her mother's legacy. A brilliant creation rejected by society, punished for existing, driven to rage and despair by the world's refusal to accept it. Mary Wollstonecraft created an idea, women's equality, that was ahead of its time. And like Frankenstein's creature, it was rejected, attacked, buried. But it wouldn't die. It persisted, and eventually, it changed the world. Why her story matters today. So why does Mary Wollstonecraft's story matter now, in 2025? Haven't we moved past all this? Don't women have rights now? Yes and no. Women in many countries can vote, can own property, can get educated, can work in most professions. These are massive achievements. But look deeper. Women still earn less than men for the same work in virtually every country. Women still do the majority of unpaid domestic labor and childcare. Women are still underrepresented in government, corporate leadership, and positions of power. Women are still told, subtly and not so subtly, that they can't have both career and family, that they need to choose, that something has to give. Women still face the motherhood penalty we talked about in earlier videos. Women's pain is still not taken as seriously by medical professionals. Women are still blamed for violence against them. Women's anger is still labeled as hysteria, while men's anger is leadership. The systems Mary Wollstonecraft criticized in 1792 still exist. They're just more subtle, more deniable, hidden behind language about personal choice and biological differences and traditional values. And here's what Mary's story teaches us. Change is slow, agonizingly slow. Mary wrote her revolutionary book in 1792. British women got the vote in 1928. That's 136 years for one right in one country. 136 years. And women in many countries still can't vote, still can't get educated, still can't leave abusive marriages, still can't control their own bodies. The fight Mary started isn't over. It's not even close to over. But her story also teaches us that one voice matters. One person speaking truth, writing it down, refusing to be silent, can start a chain reaction that changes the world. Mary didn't live to see women get any of the rights she demanded. She died thinking she'd failed, that her life had been wasted, that her ideas would be forgotten. But she was wrong. Her ideas survived. They spread. They inspired movements. They changed laws. They liberated millions of women who never knew her name. That's the power of speaking truth, even if it takes a century for the world to catch up. And finally, Mary's story reminds us to be skeptical when society tries to silence someone by attacking their character rather than their ideas. When critics couldn't refute Mary's arguments, they attacked her morals. They said she was too sexual, too emotional, too unconventional. Therefore, her ideas must be wrong. This is a classic silencing tactic, and it's still used today. When women speak up, they're called shrill, hysterical, angry. When they demand change, they're called radical, extreme, dangerous. It's the same playbook. Attack the person to avoid addressing the argument. Mary Wollstonecraft teaches us to look past that, to judge ideas on their merit, not on whether the person saying them is respectable enough, because respectability is often just another word for compliant. For willing to shut up and stay in your place, Mary was never respectable, and she changed the world. So here's what I want you to take from her story. Your voice matters. Your ideas matter. Speaking truth is worth the cost. Change is possible, even when it seems impossible. And the people who tell you to be quiet, to know your place, to stop being so difficult, they're threatened because they know you're right. They know change is coming, and they're afraid. The legacy continues. Mary Wollstonecraft died at 38, but her words lived on. Her daughter, Mary Shelley, created one of the most enduring stories in literature. Her ideas sparked movements across centuries. Her courage inspired millions of women to demand more, expect more, be more. Every woman who votes, who owns property, who gets educated, who chooses her own career, who leaves an abusive partner, who demands equal pay, who runs for office, who speaks her mind, stands on Mary Wollstonecraft's shoulders. Every man who sees women as equals, who supports their ambitions, who shares domestic labor, who raises daughters to be bold, continues her work. The revolution she started in 1792 is still happening. It's happening every time a girl is taught she's as capable as any boy, every time a woman refuses to accept less, every time someone challenges the systems that limit human potential based on gender. Every time we question tradition and choose justice instead. Mary Wollstonecraft was called mad, immoral, dangerous. She was erased from history. Her reputation was destroyed. She died thinking she'd failed. But standing here, over 200 years later, we can see the truth. She didn't fail. She planted seeds that grew into forests. She lit a fire that spread across the world. She spoke words that echoed through centuries. She was a prophet. And the world is finally catching up. So the next time someone tells you to be quiet, remember Mary. The next time someone says your ideas are too radical, remember Mary. The next time someone attacks your character to avoid addressing your argument, remember Mary. The next time you feel like giving up because change is too slow, remember Mary. She never saw the world she fought for, but she fought anyway. She wrote anyway. She spoke anyway. And because she did, millions of women who came after her got to live freer, fuller, more equal lives. That's the power of one voice refusing to be silent. This is She Speaks Anyways, reminding you that every revolution starts with someone brave enough to speak the truth, even when the whole world says they're wrong. Mary Wollstonecraft was that person, and her story proves that speaking truth is always worth it. Always. If this video moved you, hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel because we're going to keep telling the stories of women who changed the world. Share this video with every person who needs to hear Mary's story. Comment below with your thoughts. Let's keep this conversation going, because the revolution Mary started isn't finished, and we're the ones who get to continue it. The fight goes on, the work continues, and we speak anyway.